one of the most interesting people that I know to talk about all of these themes. So thanks for doing this, Mark.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
No, that's okay. And could you tell us first what, because people will guess from the time that you're not actually in New Zealand at the moment. So could you tell us what brings you to London at the moment and what you're up to here?
Yeah, you're quite right. The sun's shining. So yes, I'm in London. As you said in your introduction, I am a visiting professor at University College London in the Department of Security and Crime Science. And I've been very fortunate to be able to contribute to a master's course over the last number of years at UCL, really focused on terrorism and organized crime. But my particular interest specialism, I guess, is around intelligence. So I teach the intelligence gathering and analysis module on the course as a contribution to an MSc. So this year there's around, I think 70 students, quite international. And I particularly like the opportunity to teach because it forces you to read and to reflect. So yeah, I'm very fortunate to have the ability to do this for a number of weeks every year.
Great, fantastic. And I should just say actually to the people who are joining that the way this is going to work, if you haven't been to one before, is we're going to have a conversation between Mark and myself. You can also ask questions or make comments in the chat, so please do that. And if you have questions for Mark, I will feed those in to him in the course of the conversation. We will be publishing this on our YouTube channel, so just bear that in mind. In case there's anything you say you don't want to be public, this will be public, so just please be aware of the environment in which you're contributing. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about, Mark, was really, I mean, we've done quite a lot of work at the Police Foundation around prevention and quite a bit of thinking about the role of the police in prevention. And I just wondered if you could reflect a bit on, whether you think policing takes prevention sufficiently seriously, whether it should take it seriously, and what you think the role of the police in prevention actually is, because clearly, the police have a whole set of things they have to do. A lot of it is quite reactive, but I think most people in policing do have a sort of certainly a vocation and an idea that they want to be preventative, or they want to, it makes sense to want to stop bad things from happening in the first place. So yeah, I wonder if you could just discuss those issues.
Yeah, so I've been part of a conversation in New Zealand over many years, and the police organisation has prevention first as the national operating model. So as a way of thinking, it's something that is quite well embedded. Bringing it to life is obviously more difficult than having an aspiration. And I would say that the first thing is probably that prevention is an outcome as opposed to an activity. And I think that's quite an important point. And secondly, probably in my mind at least, it's about preventing crime today and reducing crime tomorrow. And trying to take every opportunity really to prevent harm and connecting events together, thinking more deeply about crime rather than responding to individual events, which, let's be honest, the reality of policing is we're faced with significant, in some cases, overwhelming demand, and it can take some considerable time and effort to create the space and the opportunity to do work in a preventative way, which means really, I think, looking at every incident and saying, what can I do here that will make a difference to prevent crime today and reduce crime tomorrow? That can be more time and resource intensive, requires some skills. So I'm a particular fan of problem solving as a component of policing, and I really quite like the notion of fix important problems and then tell everybody. Now, I can't claim credit, that's Malcolm Sparrow, but there's something in that. The disciplines of problem solving, I think, are quite important as a contribution to prevention. But I think the police and the police people online will know that policing understands that the causes of crime and the causes of demand are quite deep and complex, and often they're beyond the role of the police to solve on their own. And that's why I think police are well positioned to lead these kind of conversations that require deep strategic partnerships to be successful. And you know, the evidence is quite clear that the best way to deal with the underlying causes of crime is often not to deal with the crime, but to improve health and education and social outcomes. And I think policing understands that. The challenge is to get other people to see the opportunity to make their contribution. So you find police, I think, often leading a conversation. Police often know what the problems in communities are. We've often, despite the fact we often worry about our data, we've got quite good data about what's going on in communities. And police officers, police staff generally are seen as sort of community leaders in many respects. And so all of those things I think push police into a kind of position where there's an opportunity to influence the longer term outcomes, albeit some of the levers are beyond police to deliver. But there are things that we can do, and I think you know, problem solving, looking at events and saying, can I prevent this happening again? The work we do with victims, all of those things, I think, make a difference to the sort of long-term trajectory of crime.
Yeah. And do you where do you think problem solving that something which sort of has to exist everywhere in the police sort of workforce, or is it are there bits of policing where problem solving most naturally kind of fits as an activity? I mean, in this country, I think we've tended to see it predominantly as part of sort of neighborhood policing or sort of community policing. But I mean, is that your view, or is it something that can go wider than that?
So traditionally, I think it has been seen as something that's done by policing groups that are more focused on community, you know, or neighborhoods. I think that's undeniably true. And I think in most places, we've got islands of good practice. So we've got groups that are doing good work, often depending on a quality local leader, often a sergeant, you know, and good local relationships. And those exist. If people move on, they don't always survive. I think there's a difference between that kind of approach and an organization that is problem orientated as a way of doing business. And I personally think the skills of problem solving, if you just take the SARA model, you know, scan, analyze, respond, and assess, can work for most functions of policing. That doesn't mean to say that, you know, every problem needs 6 months worth of work. I think we can apply the disciplines, use the deployment model, tasking and coordination, our intelligence systems, or really bringing data and insights to a problem and then structuring ourselves around ways to deal with it. And I do think that that's something that can be done by more than just neighborhood and community groups, although you would expect them to probably have the larger opportunities, I guess, if you think about the sorts of problems that they would deal with.
Yeah, and what I mean, another part of this, I guess, is around. I mean, you talked about the need to work with other agencies, and I mean, in the debate here, people are constantly talking about the need for better partnership working. It's been difficult, partly I think because of austerity, because we've had lots of different, you know, all the different partners end up retreating to their core functions because they're worried about money. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about partnership working and how that can, you know, work in an effective way to deliver prevention.
I think the first thing I would say is it's quite important to focus on the problem first, not the partnership. So I have found in my professional career that people come together best when they have a common shared problem that they collectively want to solve. So I'm not a great fan of establishing partnerships and then looking for something to do. I'm quite a fan of find the problem and then decide who you need in the room to help you solve that problem. And sometimes in my experience anyway, we spend a long time creating the structures and the strategies and the plans which are focused on the partnership rather than the actual problem that we're trying to solve. And often the more structure you put around these things, the more difficult sometimes, you know, you can make it. So in my experience, it's that ability to bring those with a stake in the outcome. And most importantly, everybody needs to have some skin in the game. So you want people around the table who've got a shared interest in solving that problem today, because they're much more likely to be incentivized around that. So a lot of what I see is focused, I think, at the wrong end of this, which is we talk about creating partnerships. Actually, we need to be talking about solving problems and building partnerships to focus on them, in my view.
Yeah, really interesting, really helpful. And another theme I wanted to raise was around, you know, obviously we've got this. I mean, we've got this big crisis of trust and confidence in policing here in the UK at the moment, and particularly around issues that have happened in the Met. And it's true, you can see that public confidence in the police in this country has gone down quite a bit over the last few years, and trust, particularly after a lot of the incidents in the Met, particularly following the murder of Sarah Everard, you can see in the data that, you know, trust in the Met anyway has fallen, and I think, and actually now we can see in the data, trust in other forces has also fallen as well, and that's brought a lot of attention to this question of policing by consent and our basic model of policing. How do you see that, looking at it from a sort of global perspective? I mean, in terms of, you know, we've got this thing that we kind of take. I mean, it's not just Peel, but a lot of it, you know, goes back to Peel. This idea of policing by consent, policing with communities, not at communities or against communities, and yet the world in which we live has changed very radically since that time. I just wonder what your reflections are on the importance of policing by consent, and how you can do that in a world which looks very different from the one which you know, Peel was living in when he first sort of advocated for that.
It's interesting because you know, the issues of trust and confidence are not unique to this country.
Yeah.
I think it's been an issue certainly in New Zealand and for policing globally. So my sense is that there's been, you know, some pretty good deep thinking going on about how you bring some of the trust and confidence issues to the fore and what you need to do. And I think, you know, notions of legitimacy, this issue of the way that police engage with communities and the principles around that, so fairness, you know, transparency, explaining things, impartiality, and particularly this question of giving communities voice. This seems to me to be a fundamentally neglected part of the overall policing by consent model. And I would just say that I wouldn't assume that the notion of policing by consent is necessarily accepted by everybody everywhere, because it can mean different things to different people. And if you have a crime problem, for example, some people interpret policing by consent as potentially soft on crime. You know, you need permission before you can do the right things to keep people safe, which clearly is not the case, but it can be interpreted in that way. So I think it's notions of, you know, procedural justice that I think are important, and voice in particular. And then connected to that, this issue of, you know, distributive justice, I think, which is about under and over policing. So having the appropriate level of policing for the community that you're serving is fundamentally important. And this is a difficult balancing act for police leaders. But the only way really, I think, to understand whether you have these things right is to have really good community engagement and be prepared not just to engage, but to listen to the advice and the answers. So we have been involved in a piece of work in New Zealand around understanding policing delivery. And we've been looking at issues of fairness and equity as outcomes. But one of the interesting characteristics is we have an independent panel of community experts who are working with police rather than on police about these issues. And I mean, I've been in policing for quite a long time, and I have learned a lot about policing, listening to externals who would, I think, themselves describe themselves as angry friends of policing.
Right.
So we all want better policing. We have a different lens on it, but if we can trust one another's intent around those things, then I think it's possible to make progress. So I've learned a lot about policing, listening to the way that communities perceive us. And I think community groups have learned a lot about policing and understood some of the challenges because they're working with us. And that understanding has led to a greater awareness, I think, of the things that bear on issues of trust and confidence. Now, that's not easy to do. We have spent a long time building understanding, a long time in one another's company, helping people understand the way the organization works. And I think that is paying dividends. And the last thing I would say on this is, I think there's a challenge with the language in some quarters. And so the language you use is quite important. And it's not often or always the case that everybody, when they hear things, takes the same meaning and understanding from it.
Yeah, and on it, I mean, a really one point you made, which I think's really important, is this thing about it's about listening to sort of angry voices, or or. And I think one of the challenges in policing sometimes is there can be a bit of sort of defensiveness or institutional defensiveness. So, I mean, sometimes, personal defensiveness if people are sort of, in a community meeting and people are giving them very robust questioning and sometimes more than that. But also this kind of institutional defensiveness, this sort of sense that everybody's against us, we need to hunker down, and that, and then what the community hears from that is, someone pulling up the drawbridge and not wanting to engage. I mean, do you think? I mean, my reflection on that is just that it's really important in even though it is really, really difficult sometimes, it's really important in policing that that people are open to challenge, and that and that are actually see being open to challenges, but dealing with challenge is part of the job, because it's inherently a difficult job, and inherently the police have to do controversial things, and it's just part of what they are. But it's really important in that context that you're open to different views, and even quite robust and sometimes quite angry views. But it is part of the job. And if you just sort of see that anger and kind of turn away from it and think, oh, these people are just against us, we're not going to engage with them, then that kind of entrenches mistrust. So yeah, I mean, is that something that you've seen in policing globally, this tendency to be quite defensive, and how do you go about sort of discouraging that?
Yeah, look, I think policing by its nature, I mean, it's challenging. You're often dealing with people on their worst day, and you're engaged in activities which, can affect people's lives in a significant way. And I therefore think we are daily faced with difficult challenges. The way that the system around holding people to account works can make it quite difficult for people to treat every event that doesn't go so well as a learning opportunity. So the way that the system works, I think, makes it quite difficult sometimes to be open and willing to learn. I do think on the community side, some people have already made their mind up about, policing, and that can make it quite difficult for people to engage in an open-minded way. So I think there are, challenges on both sides of this. What I have found is that you need to spend time with people, building understanding and trust and confidence in. And I think that the more transparent, and there are reasons why you can and can't be sometimes, but the more transparent you can be as a police organisation, and this goes back to the principles of legitimacy, the more likely is you can build a common understanding of the issues and move forward together. And then it becomes easier to deal with things that have gone wrong, because you're starting from a more common understanding of the issues. One of the things that I have been involved in is building a sort of systems improvement model, and this is about anonymizing activity so that it becomes a easier learning experience, and not looking at sort of individual decisions, but looking at them in the context of an organization's policies, procedures, practice. Have they got the right training and the right equipment, those kind of things, and taking those as potentially learning opportunities. But one of the significant things that's come out of this is when things go wrong, there is a way to deal with them, and policing, in my experience, I think has some opportunities to deal with things that go wrong in a more, pick a term, but thoughtful, caring, open, transparent way. So that seems to me to be quite an important area of opportunity, and would do, I have found anyway, does quite a lot to help people through difficult situations. So people accept things go wrong. What they probably don't want is when we then try and explain it, we make a bad situation potentially worse.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I can think of loads of examples of that here, where the initial, if the initial response from the police had been different, then actually a lot of the confrontation that then has come out might not have been there. I also wanted to talk a bit about, I mean, I know that something you've been quite involved with is evidence-based policing, and you've given a lot of thought to this. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about the value that you think evidence-based policing can bring to policing, and also crucially, because I know this is also something you've thought quite a lot about, is how you go about embedding it in the organization, because this is the bit that I think sometimes I mean, we had Larry Sherman, who is in many ways the sort of founder of evidence-based policing. Larry did a lecture for us a few years ago where he said he titled it "Two Cheers for Evidence-Based Policing," and the reason he didn't say three cheers was that he thought it hadn't yet been, it had moved practice, and there was a lot more research going on, and it had spread globally, and the evidence base is much stronger than it used to be. But that it still isn't sort of mainstream operational practice in the way that in the way that we might want. So yeah, just what's the value, and where and how do you go about embedding this in a police organization?
I would agree with that in terms of it's not fully embedded anywhere, I think. But you're quite right, we have a better evidence base than we've probably ever had, and there's increasingly a better understanding of what the evidence and research says to you about particular problems. I think the challenge is, first of all, and I don't mean this unkindly, it can be a little bit of a cult if you're not careful. I think that there's a bit of a sense sometimes that people are zealots around some of this, and the only evidence that's good evidence is if it's not a systematic randomized control trial, at the top end, then it's not real evidence. I disagree with that. I quite like Jerry Radcliffe's hierarchy of evidence, and I think the best evidence you've got is better than no evidence. And that doesn't mean to say that everything needs to be a fully fledged trial. And in my experience, very few organizations have got the capability to do that, at pace and at strength over an extended period of time. So that's the first thing. Secondly, if you don't make this as relevant to frontline policing as possible, it will certainly fail and struggle to get traction. So how do you make this relevant to frontline policing? Well, you take on issues and provide guidance to those things that matter to frontline policing. So making, for example, it easier for frontline staff to know the sorts of good things you can do to improve the outcome for a burglary victim on their mobile phone in the moment that they need it, for example, is quite helpful. Involve staff in encouraging them to try problem solving in a simple way. And it's amazing how innovative and keen, in my experience, police frontline staff are to try different things. They just, they need a mandate. Sometimes they'll tell you that they're not qualified. Well, actually, what they just need is a bit of encouragement. And then I think creating an ability to undertake the sort of work that I think we would call evaluation. So helping people understand whether what they've done has been successful or not. That's a skill set which you do need a bit of expertise around, and that's maybe structured better at the centre, but providing that resource in a meaningful way and in a language and in terms of advice that can be understood, I think is quite important. So I have a view that in some cases we've sort of kind of over-engineered some of it. It can be a little bit academic, can be a little bit, well, it's going to take us a year. Well, actually, most policing problems require to be dealt with in days or weeks, and certainly months. And if you're waiting for a long time, then often the moment passes. So rapid evidence reviews, for example, is something that I've been heavily involved in. They make a difference in the moment to senior staff, and that can help quite a lot. So I think, at least in my experience, the idea that there's this pure model of evidence-based policing is not the model that I've been involved in thinking about and developing. It's much more about trying to use the best insights, data, and evidence that we've got to support frontline local problem solving. And that's, at least in my experience, has made some progress, I think.
And a sort of linked question, I think, is around sort of systemic learning and how you get the, so people gathering evidence, and then they're evaluating, and then they're sort of they're developing the evidence base. One of the problems I think we've got in England and Wales is partly because of the fragmentation of the system. We've got 43 forces, and actually it's quite learning doesn't pass very fluidly between those 43 forces because of the organisational barriers. And I know obviously in New Zealand there's one police organisation, but I just wondered what your reflections are on how you can get the learning from evidence gathering and innovation that's then evaluated, how you can get that learning to pass around the system effectively.
Still a challenge, even with one national organisation, because it's separated into districts and areas, and often people will say, well, it's a bit different here. So I do think that there's a way to gather knowledge together, whether through something that you might call What Works, that the police college does, or other ways of communicating that. But I have to say that I have found in the main that What Works tends to be problem and context specific. So, we probably know more about burglary than almost any other crime. and some of the international evidence and lessons don't work in quite the same way when you apply it in a local context in some other parts of the world. So I think that having a good foundation, knowing what other people have done, and then using that to ask good questions and design a plan for your patch, I think is what you're really looking for. So you want staff to instinctively know that there is research evidence and insights available on a problem. You want them to know what's happened elsewhere and to learn from it in a kind of general sense, and then use that to drive local good questions and planning and decision making locally. And if you can embed curiosity and a sort of a sense that repeat problems, embedded problems, problems that require working with other people, those are all good characteristics where looking for the evidence is a good thing. And I think we can do more when we recruit people, and we can certainly do more when we educate leaders to understand the value of that. Accepting, as I do, that policing is, overwhelmed in many ways with day-to-day demand, and creating the space to do these things is not easy. But if you don't try and break the cycle, we will, we collectively will simply be dealing with more demand forever than we can ever manage.
Yeah, no, really helpful. Embedding curiosity, I like that a lot. Just a reminder to people who are watching, you can ask questions and make comments. So if you'd like to put anything in the chat, if you've got a question for Mark, then please just do pop it into the chat, and I can put that to him. I know another thing that I know you've been thinking about a lot is about how to do change in policing, and we've obviously, there's a discussion here because of lots of the things that have been going on in relation to the Met, and we've had, and there's now a big, Mark Rowley's introduced a change program in the Met, and lots of conversations about how quickly things can change, and also whether the change you're trying to do can genuinely be transformational and can genuinely deal with some, where you've got some quite deep rooted issues around culture, for example, whether, how there's some I would say skepticism or fatalism out there about the ability to change police organizations sometimes. I mean, I pick that up talking to people sort of say, when you talk about change and I mean, I'm not asking you to comment on this, Mark, but you talk about change in the Met, people sort of roll their eyes and say, "Oh, it's always been like that. It'll never change." And I'm not a fatalist by nature. I think things can change, but I just wondered if you could talk a bit about this notion of transformational change and how and what you think that looks like in a policing context.
Yeah, I guess I have been fortunate to be involved in a range of transformation programs, to be clear, not always as the lead. I think commissioners and chief constables have to personally own transformation and change. And previous police commissioner in New Zealand would say, you cannot delegate responsibility for change or transformation. And I think those from a policing audience will know that having a mandate from the top is not just important, but fundamental. So I'm a bit of an optimist, I have to tell you, Rick, around what's possible. I think that policing is actually really quite good at change. And the reason sometimes I think we don't really believe that is because sometimes when we try and implement change, what we fail to do is to give everybody clarity around the why. Right. So we do the what and the how. And I've been at an event this week actually where it was interesting for me to listen to a lot of senior people and then some frontline practitioners. And And it was interesting listening to the frontline practitioners say, look, we actually want to do better, but can somebody please tell me why we're doing it this way and why we're doing this? So I think explaining the why is important. And I have been personally involved in programs and gone out and spent time with frontline constables and sergeants, literally thousands of them, around the country over months on a particular change program. And what was most interesting about that is they sometimes do come across as skeptical, but I don't really have a problem with that because it's my responsibility, together with others, to explain these things. And they're quite keen to ask good questions. They want to know, why is this going to be better than what we've previously been doing? Because even though, and generally these things are run out of some headquarters units, let's be honest, well, it looks like a good idea from the centre. When it finds its way to the furthest reaches of the organisation and lands, sometimes it doesn't look quite like that. And change is always political with a small p, so everybody understands how things are going to work. And even if they're not working very well, at least I understand that. Now you're going to change it. So I think the only way, in my experience, to do that is to have a really good, deep, meaningful conversation with the organisation, with your people, help them understand the why, and explain to them really the benefits of what you're trying to do. And just the final thing, really, I've had the benefit of doing some reasonably deep thinking about this area and looked at the literature from, the Harvard Business School, John Kotter's work on change in the private sector, and it has a particular set of characteristics. And then there's quite a helpful model around that the police, the College of Policing has put out. And what's quite interesting is when you compare the two things that are apparent in the policing model as compared to the private sector one is culture is at the center of the policing model. And secondly, in my view anyway, the need to run business as usual and manage the risks around that. And I think that speaks to some of the challenges that policing has got as compared to maybe some other businesses. So I don't think it's unique though. Yeah. And I think there are ways around it. And, 15 years ago, when I started doing some things, people said to me, we don't do change. And I think it's entirely possible to shift that, but it requires strong, decisive leadership. And I say the focus on a why, I think.
Yeah, really. And do you think there's an issue about because change takes time. One of the things, for example, that came out of the review that Louise Casey did into the Met was she talked in that about initiative-itis, that there was this tendency, and this is not just a policing thing, but it's a thing that happens in lots of organizations, that you tend to get, particularly when you've had churn at the top, so you've had different leaders, and every time a new leader comes in, they introduce a new strategy, and then people at the front line kind of feel like, here today, gone tomorrow. Here's just another set of buzzwords and another sort of strategy we have to deal with. And do you, do you think that's a problem? Do you, and a related question is, how do we get policing to maybe to think with a longer time horizon? Because I think this is one of the challenges, that it's such a sort of, certainly in operational terms, it's a frenetic day-to-day business. And as you were saying, you have to get the basic job done every day, in addition to doing the kind of change stuff. And sometimes that means it can be, the time horizon can be quite short term rather than long term. And there's this, and certainly even just in the limited number of years that I've been following this, I've seen lots of police organisations go through multiple changes in strategy over that period, and sometimes end up back where they started. Do you think there's an issue about a lack of long-term sort of thinking, and and how do you embed a kind of long-term program of change, you know, rather than get kind of knocked around by the day-to-day stuff all the time?
It's difficult because policing is a here-today business, and you know, it's not a very good answer to say we'll be with you when we finish the change program. You know, things, it doesn't really work that way. Then the second thing I think is, in my experience, the day-to-day will always crowd out the medium and longer term if you don't have the right structures and governance and commitment. So I think you have to commit as a leadership, as an executive, to a course of action. What I have seen often is far too many initiatives. And my experience, if you take account of the business as usual day to day, police organizations cannot really, my experience, cannot really cope with more than 4 or 5 or 6 other initiatives, and sometimes we have far too many to deal with. You need to line the money up, because the money can often be a challenge. You know, it's short term and the pressure is on to get things delivered. And fundamentally, it seems to me that we spend an awful lot more time on strategy than we do on delivery. So we have, you know, we do a lot of thinking about what we're going to achieve, and then there's a little bit of a sense that, well, the delivery is just the thing that other people do. And I think it really needs to be the other way around in a significant way. So spending much more time, I think, on delivery, and it's going back to my point about the why, engaging with staff, convincing people that things are a good idea. All of those things are fundamentally important to achieving change. So the publication of a glossy brochure that says what we're going to do about a particular problem, I'm always a little bit suspicious. There's a place for it, because sometimes you need that to convince people you've actually got a plan, but sometimes it becomes the end rather than the means, and people get rewarded for, I'm not being unkind, you know, glossy brochures, and that's not the same as achieving change. So I think, you know, the incentives, the reward systems, the finance, the executive commitment, and then having a, you know, a good plan but a focus on delivery seem to me to be the things that make a difference over the medium and longer term. I'll just make one final point, really, is that in my experience, policing, or at least some of the ones I've been involved in, it's a bit like a goldfish. You know, we've got no organizational memory. It's tied up in individuals. So continuity around change, having people that know what it used to be like and where we're trying to go with it, and holding that group together for long enough to see things through, is really important. And it's often the kiss of death, I think. If you see the 4th program manager for a change program, you know you've got a problem.
Yeah. No, really important point. I wanted to ask you about technology as well, because I think we've had you know, obviously we're living through a period of very radical technological change, which is affecting all of our lives in different ways. And policing has, and that poses a challenge both in terms of the changing nature of crime, which is obviously massively impacted by technology, but also poses a set of opportunities and challenges for the police in using technology to do their work. And I mean, policing has been, and you know, you can look at you know, potentially things like artificial intelligence have the potential to, you know, be one of the most significant technological changes that we've seen, and there are both opportunities and challenges for policing in that. But policing, you know, has, I think, as a general rule of thumb, it's tended to be at the slower end of adoption of new technologies, you know, compared to some other sectors. It's not the only sector that's sometimes struggles to adopt these new technologies, but and I just wondered what what your view was on how you can make sure that policing is able to benefit from these opportunities. What kind of things do police organisations have to do to make sure that they are better able to adopt new technologies and use them to deliver for the public?
I think generative AI could be the most disruptive technology in my professional lifetime. I mean, I see huge opportunity and potential in it, but it's not without its risks and challenges. Let's be honest. So the maturity of police organisations around, for example, the quality of data, where it's stored, who has access to it, all of those things, are challenges. And there's also the, I guess, the ethical issues around some technologies, and the debate around live facial recognition is a good one, and I think highlights just how thoughtful policing needs to be around the adoption of new technologies. So I've been involved in some technology conversations in London in the last 3 weeks, and it does seem to me as if there's some momentum about some changes in structure, and more of a bit of a sense of leadership around some of the things that need to be done to connect things. And people, sometimes say to me, well, you're very fortunate, one police organisation, one system, and yet we have many of exactly the same challenges around rolling technology out as the 43 forces in England and Wales. So structure is an issue, but it's not the only issue, I think. Yeah. So I think my view is that technology has to be and must be a part of the future in a way that it hasn't been before. I'm a bit more optimistic about policing, which I've looked back, 20 years. Actually, the transformation is quite remarkable. Yes, it might not be fast enough, and maybe things are a bit clunky, but we're working with legacy systems, and they're difficult, and procurement systems are difficult, and as a service isn't necessarily lined up with the way that capital expenditure worked in the past. So there's a whole range of challenges which make it difficult. But I'm on that sort of optimistic side of things, and I just use one example. I mean, every frontline officer in New Zealand Police has an Apple iPhone. Previous commissioner took a significant gamble and rolled 10,000 of them out, and that led to a significant number of cultural changes, I guess I think you would say, in terms of people's willingness and ability to accept, new technology. And as a way of working, we're moving towards digital notebooks. I think there's grounds to be more optimistic than perhaps some commentators give policing credit for.
Yeah, great. Well, look, thanks so much, Mark. That's been a really.
There are some questions, Rick. I don't know whether you want to.
Have they come through? I can't.
Well, I can see some questions in the chat. Yeah.
Oh, I can't see them. So this is why I haven't been asking them through. Well, do you, in which case, do you want to answer some of the questions in the time we've got left? Because I unfortunately my chat for some reason isn't showing them. So
yeah. There's a question here about considering the problem ahead of the partnership. As a violence reduction unit, we have found it challenging to get partners on board, with violence reduction being a partnership problem whilst they're under so much pressure with core functions already. Do you have any advice around building positive and genuinely collaborative partnerships? I think I understand the problem, and I think it's a fairly common problem, and agencies have their own core roles and responsibilities. I think I'll go back to what I said about focusing on the problem, and I understand that's an easy thing to say and more difficult to do. But often non-police organisations, in my experience, struggle with the amount of discretion, for example, that frontline staff have, the way the money's lined up, their performance indicators and targets. So what I have found is important is to try and get deeply inside the problems that others have. So see the world through the other person's lens, if I can put it that way. And sometimes the problems that need solved can't be done at a local level. They actually need elevated to a level where people have the mandate to do that. And sometimes that's the chief executive can be the only person that can unfreeze things. So I haven't necessarily got the answer, but what I do know is that the more you have the ability to understand other people's worldview and the things that make things difficult for them, the more likely you are to find common ground in areas of opportunity, and finding some things to get the wheels turning, build momentum, build confidence, and find ways to get mutual benefit out of, even if it's a small part of a bigger problem, can lead to other things happening. I'll just, one example, we have a similar challenge around youth crime in parts of New Zealand, particularly post-pandemic. 12 to 16-year-olds ram raiding shops, a real spike and concern. Actually, the data analysis identified a relatively small number of people, a system built involving 20 agencies to focus on the problem, and a long time spent in one another's company, seeing the world through the lens of every partner. So building trust and confidence, I think, is probably my answer to that. There's a question about POP is very consistent with Deming. I'm not familiar with that. Sarah Lager. Lean-like programs are about purpose, outcomes, culture, small team analysis, coordination, and lessons, resource planning, and skills maturity. Those approaches are very well established. Accuracy, not in policing. Is policing really that different, or just a missed opportunity to replicate some approaches? I think genuinely, I think there's a. This is just my observation. This might not actually be true of everything, but policing seems to place particular value on experience at the expense of other things that might be important. Now, that's a general statement, and it's certainly not true everywhere and of every issue. But it feels to me over the last 20 years, we have moved to a position where we are more open-minded about using evidence. We are actually a more diverse workforce. We are actually interested in systems and processes and building things that will get resources to the right place at the right time. So at the risk of sounding more optimistic than we are in reality, I think I personally believe there is always a place for experience. It needs to be balanced with some of the system things that we know work in other industries or in other sectors. And I do think, in my experience, and I've been doing this for a while, policing is moving in the right direction with it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. And my apologies for not asking those questions earlier. I've just realised I had my chat muted.
One more question, Rick, which is about, my sister is about to join the Met. What advice would you give to her as she sets out on a career as a neighbourhood police officer? Well, policing is a fantastic opportunity to make a difference. And in my view, your sister will be dealing with some of the most difficult, demanding problems that a young person can face. And I think bringing the right skills and mindset to the role is really important. And at least for me, my daughter is in a partnership with a frontline police officer, and he struggles with some of the things that the organization asks, some of the ridiculous systems that we have in place. But what he's never had is any doubt about the value that he's adding to the country, and in trying to do his best when people are often having their worst day. So my advice is to make the most of it, but to find ways to deal with the things that will inevitably cause stress and difficulties, but not try and let them drag every day down to it's a problem, because in my experience, talking to lots of people, policing is just the most fantastic profession to be in. As a frontline person, I mean, you know.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Mark. And I think yeah, the big thing that I've taken from this is is your optimism about the future. And sometimes it's very because policing is at the center of lots of it's the focus of a lot of attention, and it gets a lot of criticism and so on. Sometimes it can, you know, that there's a tendency not to be sort of optimistic about the future. So I think you know, you've certainly given us all, I think, some good reasons to have some optimism that things you know, things are getting better. They have been getting better, and policing can make a huge difference to people's lives. So look, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all for coming along and putting in your questions. Just to advertise, our next Friday exchange will be in a couple of weeks' time. We'll be putting it out on our social media, so follow that, and that will be with Sal Nassim, who is a former regional director at the Independent Office of Police Conduct. So we'll be talking about police complaints, police accountability, governance around policing, and the way in which police complaints are dealt with. So please do join us for that. But in the meantime, thanks very much, Mark, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.